It's go time.
The Canadian football season is almost upon us, but its kickoff is in the books. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Third Down Gamble. Don Charbon along with Heath Graham. The CFL Draft. I love it because it's always a sign that football is coming. And ultimately, no real major surprises coming out of the draft. Calgary makes a trade. Pretty quiet, though, otherwise.
It's always interesting to see the names that come up and a real mix of U Sport athletes and NCAA athletes. So really fun to watch where all these guys are coming from.
The first round, looked like it was going to be a run of NCAA players. But then in the middle of that round, Calgary goes to Benjamin LaBrosse out of McGill, and then Kevin Mattel from Laval. U Sport showed well in the first round, 4 of the 9 picks. Overall, you know that the NCAA players typically get more attention, and there's 2 reasons for that, I think. Partly because, yes, it may be better competition down there, although that could be debatable in some senses. But the other thing is the exposure that they get in the States is just exponentially more valuable, because up here we just don't get the coverage that is needed in U Sport to really showcase these players.
That's very true, and a lot of the NCAA athletes get that opportunity to have a combine south of the border, and there's a lot more comparable data because of the sheer volume of athletes competing in that combine versus the CFL and U Sport combine. So you're really seeing matchups and numbers against a vast array of athletes.
Yeah, and now looking back at the draft itself, Joel LeBlanco, no surprise, goes number 1 from Cincinnati to the Elks. He is, as by all accounts, he is game ready. He's had his chance in the NFL. He's played in the USFL. You may wonder, well, how is he still eligible? But Canadian eligibility rules are a little bit different than what they do in the United States. The nuances I'm not going to get into. Just suffice to say that professionalism doesn't necessarily discount you up here. So he gets drafted number 1. There was so much chatter about would Chris Jones do something with the pick? Would he move it? Would he do something off the wall, off the board? And he just went right down exactly Main Street. The interesting thing is he followed up with another linebacker with his next pick.
Well, if there's one thing people talk about with Chris Jones is he loves defense, and this is a great pick if you've got a game-ready Canadian linebacker ready to step into that lineup. It was a pick that is as close to a sure thing as you can get. It's never 100% certain in the CFL or any professional sport that a guy drafted is going to elevate his game and be a star in whatever league they're drafted into. But this guy looks like he's ready to go. 6'2", 231 pounds, a really good size for a linebacker. Interesting to see a lot of moves in receiver and defensive backs in this draft as we get a little bit further on as well.
The overall tenor of the draft was certainly dominated by how many receivers and defensive backs were picked up. In fact, the second pick overall, Nick Mardner out of Auburn, is an example of that. Now, if you look at any of the first 3, only DeBlanco is going to be in Edmonton this year. It's tough to say whether Ottawa's pick of Mardner or Saskatchewan, who came with an offensive lineman in Kyle Hergel, whether he's going to be back necessarily. But there's an interesting sort of sidelight to all of this. And Hergel, when he goes to New Orleans, what kind of money have they expended on him? And it's $20,000 US, 10 of which is guaranteed. That's considered a little bit on the low end of sort of interest in that context. If you're getting 100 or more, then that team is really looking to say, hey, we're definitely interested now. You come down here and let's see what we can do. With Hergel, it's more of we'll take a flyer on you and see what happens.
Absolutely. Nick Mardner, you look at his size as well, 6 foot, 590 pounds. Absolutely, he's going to get a look. He's a receiver of that height and that size is somebody that there's going to be a lot of interest in. If he does make his way back up here to the Ottawa Red Blacks, he could be a key game changer as far as a Canadian receiver in this league.
And you could argue that with Kevin Mattel as well with the Argonauts. And Toronto, a team, despite the defections in the offseason with free agency, are still strong in their Canadian content. Their offensive line is solid. They've got decent Canadian receivers with Brissett. There's enough there that they could kind of pick and choose where they wanted to go with their draft picks. That's always a luxury. It's a bit of a danger, too, because granted you're good now, what happens in 3 years? And you've always got to be thinking towards the future.
And you look at other teams as well. So the one trade in the first round was Calgary traded up with the 8th overall pick from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Winnipeg traded down and ended up with the 13th and 14th picks. So 2 second-round picks back-to-back. Some video of their draft room surfaced today of the conversations they had when making this trade. And the consensus was Calgary was trading up to get an offensive lineman, which is exactly what they did. Winnipeg takes those other 2 picks and picks up a wide receiver and a Canadian running back. So you talk about teams restocking their cupboards. Look at Winnipeg in that running back position. They've got Brady Oliveira, Johnny Augustine behind him, and now Michael Chris Ike as another Canadian running back. So obviously the Bombers are focused on keeping that position as a Canadian.
And it's a kind of a neat little luxury for the Blue Bombers because they had 3 picks in the second round. Now, if you're the Stampeders, you start the draft day with 1 pick in the first round and then the 13th overall in the second, and you make that trade. Now you've got 2 picks in the first round. You've got who you wanted. And Winnipeg goes, well, we got 13, 14, and 17. Not a bad situation to be in.
And 20. Winnipeg actually ended up with 4 picks overall in the second round.
That is right. And that's that reward for Canadian snaps. Now you think, well, what does that mean? Well, essentially, the British Columbia Lions and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers led the league in the number of plays that Canadians were on the field. And instead of what they used to do was give these as territorial picks to the 2 worst records, they said, enough of that. Let's go with the people that are using local talent to play football. So it's no irony in my books that 2 of the top 3 teams in the league last year also played Canadians the most snaps.
And not even the most snaps, but they had often more than the required number of Canadians on the field. Winnipeg often had 8 or 9 Canadians. BC was pretty close by there as well. And if you look at the picks that they got with these bonus second round draft picks, the Lions pick up wide receiver Ezekiel Tayade, 6'2", 205 pounds. The Bombers pick up Kyle Sampson from UBC, 6'3", 290-pound D lineman. He's a monster and somebody that can hopefully fill some gaps on that Winnipeg D line.
It was interesting to me that the Blue Bombers didn't go hard after O-line right away because they did have some losses on the offensive line. They do pick up Gabe Wallace from Buffalo with the 17th pick, but I kind of thought that maybe with one of the 2, 13 and 14, they would have grabbed somebody. They're not a young offensive line, I'll put it that way.
That's a great point. Gabe Wallace, 6'6", 305 pounds, got some size. 2 picks before him, the Lions picked up Theo Benedette, 6'7", 300 pounds. So there are some big offensive linemen in this draft class.
Yeah, and BC, of course, taking the risk. Hey, we drafted him. Will he make the NFL or not? He's got the tryout. Again, these rookie camps that they have down in the States, odds are that you're not going to make it, but you never know. And this is kind of where the first round of the CFL has fallen into. You either get the blue chip that's going to be here, or you're going to get the guy that you think is really, really great, but we may have to be patient.
It is a risk, and it's an opportunity. These mini camps, you have a very short opportunity to make a big impact. You have to go in and impress right away. And while we're on the topic of the NFL draft, I just want to mention Quantez Stiggers was picked up in the 5th round by the New York Jets, last year's outstanding rookie in the CFL. And you want to see a guy that made an impression. Didn't play college ball. He got an opportunity to play in the East-West Shrine Bowl in the U.S. and really showed well there and has been rewarded with an NFL pick.
For the Argonauts, it's another loss. They can't compete money-wise, and they're going to let him get his chance to play in the NFL. If Stiggers doesn't make it, then like Jamal Peters, who they let try with I believe it was the Falcons, it didn't work out for him. He came back.
There's something to be said for not burning bridges on your way out. You don't know what the future holds. I believe Contes has a really strong and positive opinion of the CFL. He's very thankful for the opportunity he had with the Toronto Argonauts, and for them to facilitate his opportunity to try out in the NFL shows a lot of character for the organization as well. They want what's best for the player, and absolutely a year or two down the road, if that NFL dream is over, you know who he's going to make that call to if he wants to come back to the CFL.
Well, and especially when it comes to a drafted person, because those guys, their first port of call has to be the team that drafted them. That's part of the rule package that we have in the CFL. That helps CFL teams then take that risk and say, okay, we know that we have to allow for this every once in a while, but the return for us is if it doesn't work out, then we still have first dibs. We still have a chance to sign this player and make it happen up here. The other draft that happened that day was the global draft, and it doesn't get anywhere near the press, where in years past it was maybe being accused of a punter's draft. This year, not really the case.
There were still a lot of kickers and punters drafted, but a lot of defensive players as well, some defensive linemen, linebackers, and I hope this is showing the skill level of these international players. Yes, they're still punters and kickers and probably a lot of rugby backgrounds coming in, but we've seen some success in global players in some other positions. It looks like there are some teams taking a serious look in some of these spots as well.
Every punter drafted in the global draft is from Australia. Is that a coincidence?
Well, we've seen some success already on CFL rosters, so it's not really surprising that Australia is where they're taking a look for these guys.
What it does say to me is that the quality of player coming from the rest of the planet is starting to improve. And one of the things that you're seeing is that a lot of these players are coming through U Sport or NCAA. They still have that global heritage, I guess it is, that they count as, and so you can be brought into the lineup through that, and that really helps them get going. The biggest thing out of this that I take is, other than the 5 punters all from Australia, is I agree with you, it was a lot of defenders that were being grabbed, linebackers, defensive backs, and that is a sort of a bit of the start of the paradigm shift, that these players now are not seen as necessarily special teamers.
Yeah, and you look at it, as you mentioned, a lot of players getting some college experience. 7 of the 9 drafted in the first round played some level of NCAA football, and in the second round it is 8 of 9. So it's really interesting also to see that development of global players getting the opportunity to play U Sport, to play NCAA football, develop their skills, and now they are turning that into a pro opportunity.
Other stories that came out of the Canadian Football League, and this is a little bit older, but it's worth diving into to understand it. 3 teams from last year were over on the salary cap. They were the Hamilton Tiger Cats at $2,654. Winnipeg was $25,947, and BC at $85,979. Not huge amounts in any case, and basically the fine structure is that up to $100,000, it's $1 per dollar for going over. Some people think that wasn't enough. I'm fine with it the way it is. This has sort of been structured in from the initial agreement on the salary expenditure cap way back in 2006.
That first $100,000 over is essentially a luxury tax. As you said, you're paying dollar for dollar to be over. If a team can afford it, realistically, why not go over that amount? And you look at the dollar amounts that they're over. Really, the BC Lions were the only team that was over by an equivalent amount of a full-time roster player. The other ones, Hamilton's was so minuscule, it's almost a rounding error, less than $3,000. In a cap where you're getting that many players on the roster and on the field any given week, they were doing everything they could to be within that cap. That's just a little tweak there. Winnipeg, $25,000 over. Again, if you look at a minimum salary around that $70,000 range, not even about a third of a season of a minimum wage player there. So the real damages start if you're over that $100,000 in excess of the cap. We haven't seen a team get to that point over the last couple of seasons, and 2 or 3 teams over seems to be kind of the norm at this point.
If you're wanting to know, from 100,000 to 300,000, it's $2 for every dollar that you're over, and a first round pick is lost. And then, of course, over 300,000, it's 3 to 1, so $3 for every dollar over that, and a first and second round. That, I think it's tough enough. I know it comes down to a luxury tax in a sense, but we're not seeing a situation where teams are just running roughshod over the cap. It's pretty strong forensic auditing going on.
And you look at injuries and replacement players and those sorts of scenarios that come into play, it's easy to see how you can go over. So teams do a pretty good job of keeping it within that $100,000 overture. They pay the penalty and move on from there. I agree. I like the fact that it does get more punitive as you're further in excess of that cap. There needs to be something in place to reel that back in. So that $100,000 really gives you a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of leeway to balance things out.
And one of the things that you have to remember too is that injuries play into the cap, and teams will go over depending on how the injuries play out. If you've got a bunch of 6-game players, you're paying those salaries, but the cap does allow for you to take care of their replacements without getting too punitive on you for doing so. So you could see teams spending more than the cap allows and not got hit because there's an injured list that's in the infirmary for the whole season. How do you juggle that? So there is some allowance that way. The other thing that goes on, and we don't play it up enough, is that every year the cap is going up. It started at just over $4 million when it was first introduced in 2007 season. It's now 5.525 as it continues to grow. The other thing is that for the first time ever, now players are going to get a share of the television revenue contract.
That's an exciting opportunity for the players. It shows growth in the league, and any of these opportunities to enhance the salaries of the players is a very positive experience. One other thing of note that has come up recently is that players can also be paid by the team marketing dollars that don't come into the cap as well. So that's an opportunity to have players earn a little bit more within those communities and on those teams that they sign with.
Exactly. And there's a limit to how much you can spend on that. In a case where you've got, let's say, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, if you want your guys to market up in the northern part of the province, or if you're the Ticats or the Argonauts and you want to go up into the northern part of Ontario, that's a big commitment to take 2 or 3 days to make the trip, do your presentations, and come back. You need to be compensated for that. Now, how they allow for that, maybe that has to be fine-tuned. These players, there's a commitment that you sign, the player services contract that you have to adhere to. You have to be at practice. You have to be ready for games, all that sort of stuff. But then this is above and beyond the expectation of being a player. Shawn Lemon has been suspended indefinitely for participating in wagering activities involving Canadian Football League games, including one in which he was played, according to the allegation on CFL.ca. This happened back in 2021 when he was a member of the Calgary Stampeders.
It's a sad situation. Shawn Lemon had a real comeback season last year with the Montreal Alouettes. He was a key component of that Grey Cup winning team and re-signed an extension with the Alouettes only to then suddenly retire. And you have to think that the retirement was because he knew this news was coming and tried to get out ahead of it. Unfortunately for Shawn, the story broke that it was gambling related and that he has been suspended indefinitely. This is a real challenge for professional sports leagues because so much is dependent on gambling revenue. Any sports broadcast is chock full of gambling ads, and there has to be a way to manage that, and it's going to continue to be more challenging the more prominent and more accessible these gambling options become.
We've seen it in the NFL where some Detroit Lions were punted for gambling, although the type of gambling they were doing was done in the facility, and this was the big problem, that you can gamble on other things outside the facility, you just can't do it in the facility. So that's where they got into trouble. And then, of course, there's the now becoming famous story of Jonte Porter from the Toronto Raptors, who's banned for life from the NBA after violating their league gambling rules, and that was with prop betting. And that involved him and involved the team. The worst thing in the world that any league need face is this idea that games could be fixed.
It is. Now, the story broke that Shawn Lemon did gamble on a game in which he participated. We don't know all the details of that. It doesn't appear that he bet on his team to lose. I mean, you can look at that as the same thing as the Pete Rose argument in betting on baseball. He bet on Reds games, but he always bet them to win. Now, how that plays out as a manager is a little bit different than a player. So it doesn't seem to be any accusation of him influencing the outcome of the game, but it does put a bit of a black mark on his career, unfortunately, for a player that is of Hall of Fame caliber.
First, the Alouettes were on top of it, saying that they were aware of an investigation and they suspended him. And then the Stampeders then responded, saying that they were dismayed, disappointed by what went on. There's been some conjecture too about how swiftly this sort of played out, and then if you look at the Chad Kelly situation, everything seems to be plodding along. Even at the draft, the commissioner was asked, what can you say about the investigation? And he said, I can't say anything about the investigation. And partly because there is an investigation and you don't want to unduly influence it one way or the other.
The incident with the Argonauts and Chad Kelly is interesting, though, in the fact that there have been players suspended for accusations a lot less serious than this. It's taking a lot of time with Chad Kelly. I know everybody involved wants to get it right, but with training camps now just weeks away, you have to wonder when this investigation is going to wrap up and what happens at that point. Is it easier or better for the team to take action early and suspend, in which case they can move on, or is it better for them to wait till things come to fruition, hoping it doesn't come to a suspension, but also running the risk of late in the season having to lose your starting quarterback to suspension?
Well, we've seen players with alcohol problems get suspended. Greg Ellingson, Jake Dolegala, Kenny Lawler of the Blue Bombers, and those tend to be pretty quick. But then again, that's something where the courts have already stepped in. It's pretty easy for the league to... The thing about Chad Kelly, and there's some speculation, well, if he wasn't the MLP, then what would they be doing? And I don't know if that plays into it. I just do believe that because these allegations have to be tested in court, that the CFL is kind of conscripted in a little way, that there's not much they can do other than having their own investigation to determine within their universe what they can do. Randy Ambrosi said the investigation goes without any holds on it. It gets to go whatever direction it needs to sort this out. One of the things that has been suggested, and this is John Hodge, especially at 3 Down Nation, maybe the CFL should look at a commissioner's list where you take a player and say, look, you're under investigation. We're going to put you over here for a while.
I guess the difference here and some of the alcohol issues that you mentioned with other players is the teams sometimes took it upon themselves to take action before the league did as well. And Kenny Lawler in Winnipeg is one example of that. He was charged with DUI. The Bombers suspended him immediately before the league even had an opportunity to react. And we're not seeing that with the Argonauts here, partially because they are also named in this lawsuit and they don't want to assume guilt by suspending a player.
Exactly. Everyone is sort of really tied to what comes next in terms of the allegations and what comes next in terms of what happens in the courts. Because yes, the Argonauts are named as well as Chad Kelly in this process. You have to be very careful about how you tread.
Like I said, it is definitely a risk, because if this does get proven that both the organization and the player acted inappropriately, it could be catastrophic later on in the season if they're facing suspension and loss of that player.
We've got the civil case going forward on one front. We've got the CFL investigating on another front. I don't know how this is all going to play out.
This also puts the Argonauts in a tough situation, because you have to think it's going to be a distraction for them throughout the season. Every city that they travel to for a road game, there are going to be questions coming up from the media asking about this situation. It's going to weigh heavily on Chad Kelly and on the management of the Argonauts. So it'll be interesting to watch how they play and how it affects that on-field performance.
As we get to training camps, the rookies roll in on Sunday. The veterans come in the following week. Is there any storyline that you think is going to be important? The Elks retooling, maybe making a run this year. The Blue Bombers, are they making another cup run? What do you think we should be watching for as teams start to break camp?
The one thing I'm watching this year is I believe the West is going to be very competitive. I think with the head coaching change in Saskatchewan, the Riders are on a bit of an upswing. We're now into that third season of Chris Jones with the Edmonton Elks. They're bringing back a veteran quarterback in McLeod Bethel-Thompson to help settle things in Edmonton. I think they're going to be a lot more competitive. We know BC and Winnipeg are still going to be Grey Cup contenders. Calgary is the question mark for me in the West. And in the East, Montreal was such an unexpected Grey Cup champion, I think, at the start of last season. It'll be interesting to watch how they defend. And, of course, the biggest question mark is the Ottawa Red Blacks. And are they going to have new pieces in to help turn things around for the Red Blacks?
This is going to be Drew Brown's coming out party. This is his opportunity to take a franchise and run with it. And Ottawa needs that. They're going to have Jeremiah Mazzoli as well in. And depending on how they proceed, we may see Crum. We may see a lot of other quarterbacks in the third string position. But that other story that I'm thinking about is the Hamilton Tiger Cats, who took a big tumble last year. Still made the playoffs, but how are they going to be? Taylor Powell, where does he fit in all of this? Because they're definitely putting their stock into Bo Levi Mitchell to get healthy and get going.
The fun part of the training camps is the speculation. And like they say on opening day in Major League Baseball, everybody's tied that first week. And you start to see the trends coming after that. But when week one rolls out, everybody's at 0-0 and everybody's a contender.
And in Saskatchewan, they've been talking about how they need the culture changed. There was so much talk about how Corey Mace was changing the culture in the locker room. I don't know that he's had the team together in a locker room to do anything about that yet, but most likely that is going to happen. Whether or not the Rough Riders are this contender that everyone thinks they're going to be, I'm not totally convinced that they will be. They're definitely going to be better. A playoff team, most likely, but then who isn't going to be in the West? There's the question. Before we leave you, one of the things that we're going to be doing again this year is having our little fun pool with Pool Tracker. And what we do on our show is we have people participate with point spread involved. Most of the pools that you get, the CFL, are just straight win. But ours are a little bit more complex, and that is, say Winnipeg is playing Ottawa opening night, and they're in Winnipeg. Well, Winnipeg should win that game, correct? But you put a spread on it. Now it makes it a little bit tougher. Can Ottawa cover if it's -9 or +9? That's what we do. So if you're interested, I'll give you the email address for the show. It's thethirddowngamble@gmail.com. thethirddowngamble@gmail.com. And by all means, hit me up if you're interested. We'll see if we can get you in. It'll start when the season starts.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean and can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Follow us on Twitter at Third Down Gamble. Join us again, the Third Down Gamble podcast, audio worth watching.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources provided by Canadian Football League player and game statistics for analytics, game notes, and statistics, and 3downnation.com for news, insight, and in-depth analysis. Please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com for the most up-to-date information on the Canadian Football League.